I really think that the Easter Rising of 1916 is a profoundly interesting moment in Irish history. I'm going to talk some about the kind of actual mechanics of the Rising itself. But what I think is in a way more interesting, I mean, it's one of a sort of series. Those of you who are familiar with the kind of larger panorama of Irish history, if you will know that it's one in a sort of series of failed revolts against British rule that happened in Ireland periodically. And so what's interesting about it in a way is the way that it failed and what it sort of gave rise to subsequently. And I try to sort of underline this in the sort of subtitle of the talk, The Birth of the Irish Republic, because even though they fail, even though the rebellion itself lasts only about 5 days, depending on how you count, they manage to actually plant a seed that 6 years later, or 5 years later, results in the formation of the Irish Free State and eventually the Irish Republic. So the question is, what is the role of the Easter Rising in that happening, and how does it fit into kind of the broader sweep of Irish history? Once again, those of you who are familiar with a bit of Irish history will know that Ireland in the 10th century was a sort of collection of small monarchies, for lack of a better word, dozens and dozens of them. They had a system of land tenure that was very different than the system that was common in the rest of the British Isles. They had a system of law, the Brand Law, that was very different than the rest of the British Isles, and had not been sort of unified in the way that the rest of Britain had, especially in the wake of the Norman conquest. So in 1169, a Welsh noble named Richard de Clare, who's often called Strongbow because of his apparently prowess with archery, although we don't know a great deal more about that, landed at Bannostrand in County Wexford. He had been sort of called in. There was one of the sort of defining features of Irish political life in those days was conflict among the various small principalities, kingdoms, what have you. And he was called in on one side of one of these kind of fights as a sort of representative of Henry II, the Angevin king of England. Some of the things I've read suggested that Henry really was of two minds. I mean, he really didn't. He viewed Strongbow as kind of perhaps a threat. So I think perhaps his feeling was either he'll get something done there, which would be great, or he'll get killed, which is. But he lands with about 600 knights, and they pretty quickly start to sort of execute a kind of expansive policy on their own account. And so what you get by the 11th century is the importation of a lot of Norman aristocrats being sort of put in charge of Irish land. And it starts this very long process that you see sort of happen over and over, which is that a set of aristocrats will come over from England. And this is essentially what happened in England in the Norman conquest. Sort of you see kind of like a Norman political structure kind of superimposed on England. Well, once again, you see this process of a Norman political structure superimposed on Ireland. And what happens is the aristocrats will come over, they'll be around for a while, they'll sort of go native. They'll learn Irish, their children will learn Irish, they'll marry into the local aristocracy, and then they become kind of Irish. And it was a matter of sort of real consternation to the people back home, because what they wanted was really sort of a more kind of a more sort of a kind of resource extraction model with less sort of sympathy to the locals, which is not to say that things were great, but they were a lot better than they turned out to be later on. So a series of laws gets passed over the course of a century and a half. The Statutes of Kilkenny, which essentially said that, so there was a kind of Irish government, and it essentially said that decisions of that government had to be sort of run by the central English government. Poynting's law intensifies this. And then there were the penal laws, which essentially said, well, we'll get to the penal laws in a minute because that's a little ways down the line. But things were mostly pretty all right. I mean, this was in kind of the sort of normal mode of conquest in those days. The people it was a very kind of elite-oriented thing, right? Like the people down the income distribution, if you will, or down the kind of the lower orders, mostly didn't really care. I mean, they didn't identify like emotionally with, oh, so-and-so was the local aristocrat before, but now it's someone else from somewhere else. They didn't really, still like, I have to pay this amount, and, so they didn't really, but it worked reasonably well. It wasn't an intensely conflict-ridden system. This really changes with the Reformation, starting in the 16th century. Henry VIII, for reasons of his own, came into conflict with Rome. Already there had been conflict brewing between, there's a long-running, those of you who are familiar with European history will know, and I unfortunately can't go much deeper into this, but there's a sort of long-running feud between the sort of temporal aristocrats and the papacy about who's going to have rule in the world as opposed to rule over souls. Henry, to a great extent to deal with his sort of marital problems, with his 6 wives, there's a sort of little thing that British school children learn. It's something like divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, lived, or something like that. I mean, he went through a whole sort of range of these from Catherine of Aragon. Just as an aside, and this is irrelevant, but I think it's a kind of a funny story. Henry had never met Catherine of Aragon before he was going to marry her. He'd only seen a painting of her by a famous Dutch artist whose name is escaping me right at the moment. But she looked much better in the painting, apparently. So when she showed up, like, Henry's like, oh my God, I've really been sold a bill of goods here. But what started to happen was an intense and intensifying conflict between the Catholic nobility, who were now really very much a native nobility in Ireland, and those more Protestant ones, more sort of like heavily connected with the British monarchy. And what happens is a series of plantations, so at first there's a revolt down in, I'm going to stop here and take a breath. Ireland is divided into 4 regions: Leinster, Munster, Ulster, and Connaught. And the first sort of major problem is in the earldom of Desmond in Munster. There you can see the earldom of Desmond is very large. They stage 2, the Earl of Desmond stages 2 sort of revolts. They fail. And what you get, just to back up for a second, is a kind of plantation of more sort of Protestant nobles into Munster. But then what you get in a sort of, starting in the later 16th and into the 17th century is the revolt by the O'Neills and the O'Donnells, who were the sort of major aristocrats in Ulster. And they are very intensely Catholic, very intensely Irish. These are put down with incredible violence. And then, so the British, the kings of England, and then subsequently Cromwell, after Cromwell takes over in the English Revolution, decide that what they're going to do is solidify their rule here by putting in people who really hate Catholics. And who hates Catholics more than not just, there was the sort of Church of Ireland, which was the kind of the Irish version of the Church of England. That was like a very small sliver of the Protestant people in Ireland. What they really wanted to do was bring in Protestants, because Protestants absolutely loathed Catholics, and so you didn't have to convince them not to go native. They they were a very sort of intensely partisan group and continue to be to this day. I mean, if you sort of look at the politics of Ulster now, that there's a very intense strain of fundamentalist Protestantism that goes on in Northern Ireland, which is a direct result of these plantations. So the situation that results is one in which there's a sort of Protestant, mostly Protestant, some Catholic aristocracy. And the very intense Presbyterians in the north, industrial development starts more heavily up there. I mean, this is the 18th century, so industrial development means something rather sort of on a smaller scale than we think of it now. But what you get is a very intense and a very intensely dissatisfied and heavily exploited peasantry. I mean, Ireland is predominantly a peasant society at this point, predominantly agricultural. The vast majority of people live on the land and make their living there. By the 18th century, they've become predominantly a monoculture society, that is to say potatoes. They raise cattle. There are very large cattle raising estates, especially in Munster, but across the country. But that beef and the other dairy products are by and large for export. So that in the 18th and 19th century, the average Irish laborer is going to be eating about 10 pounds of potatoes a day, and that's it. Boiled in buttermilk is like the sort of standard scene of the Irish peasantry is to go into the house and find like a pot of buttermilk, boiling lumper potatoes all day, and that's it. Maybe on feast days you would have a little bread and butter or possibly a little bit of meat. The reason this works is because the potato is an incredible source of nutrition. It's almost nutritionally complete. In times when I was poor, I just ate lots and lots of potatoes because it really, which works great until now. The real danger in a monoculture is that if some blight afflicts the potato, as periodically happens, then nobody has any food. And this is what happened in the 1840s. There was a series of blights that afflicted the potato. Now, the sort of common idea about the sort of Irish potato famine in the 1840s is that it was a sort of, it was a huge catastrophe. The Irish population at the beginning is right around 8 million people. By the end, it's about 6 million people. And demographically, the Irish never quite recovered. But it was mostly in the south and the west. It was not mostly in Ulster. It was not mostly in Leinster, the area around Dublin and further to the eastern part of the country. It was mostly in the more rural parts, the more Irish-speaking parts. It dealt a real blow to the Irish language, which also the English were trying to extirpate anyway. But the areas that were most affected by the famine, and the famine not only killed a lot of people, but compelled a lot of people to emigrate. My family, by the way, came from Leinster. They came from a fairly, a part that was almost completely unaffected by the famine. So my family were not refugees by any stretch from the famine. They came really because they thought they'd get a better deal here, which, as it turned out, I think was not a bad play from my perspective. But what you get is this very intense blow to Irish society that results in a further kind of polarization between the kind of those who are sort of England focused and those who aren't, especially the peasants. Up to this point, the sort of interest in Irish culture had been mostly a sort of Anglo-Irish thing. If you look back at who's interested in Irish culture and who's trying to sort of like collect the older poems and the sort of oral tradition of Irish culture, it's mostly Protestants. And by the same token, the first sort of major failed revolt, I mean, not the first, but the first in the sort of modern period, is the United Irishmen Rising in 1798, which is very much influenced by the French Revolution, has a lot of the same sort of slogans, and is run to a great extent by Anglo-Irish Protestants like Theobald Wolfe Tone. He's the sort of name that's mostly associated with it. They're hoping for sort of French assistance. The French send a fleet, which comes to grief off the west coast of Ireland. There's still sort of like, if you go out to the towns on the west coast, a lot of times you'll find kind of artifacts from the French fleet. They land. It's a catastrophe. All the leaders are executed. There's another sort of abortive rebellion, Emmet's Rebellion in 1803. This started in Dublin, and they didn't really get it off their own block. I mean, it really was another sort of failed event. In the 1840s, what you see is the rise of a movement called Young Ireland, which is more of like a sort of cultural movement. And the 1840s are often referred to as the kind of springtime of nations, when these sort of smaller states in Europe suddenly decided that they were like a sort of ethno-national group, and this happened to the Irish too. It's not to say that there was no consciousness about Irishness before this, but if you look sort of throughout Europe in the 1840s, the Czechs all of a sudden discover that like Czechness is a thing, and they need a literary language, which they haven't got now, so they have to have like Czech authors like start writing novels in Czech, which to that point hadn't happened very much. And once again, you get in Ireland sort of like people studying Irish culture, but now it's more sort of the kind of Catholic Irish. Now, it hadn't been so much done before, and one reason was because it was hard for Catholics because of the penal laws to get into the university system. To get into Oxford and Cambridge at this point, and for a long time after this, you had to swear, you had to like say, I'm an Anglican. You had to sort of sign and say that you accepted the sort of premises. And Trinity College was essentially originally a kind of Protestant, Trinity College Dublin was a kind of Protestant affair, as it were. In the 1860s, you get something called the Fenian Brotherhood, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Fenian movement. And this is a sort of another kind of physical force movement. So there's two main political strains going on here. There's Irish parliamentarism, and then there's the Fenians, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who are much more about trying to physically remove Irish rule. And part of the sort of underlying idea here is the participation of large numbers of Irish people in the American Civil War. You have now several thousand Irish in America who have extensive training in the use of weapons and military tactics. There's what's called the Clan na Gael, which is the sort of American-Irish organization, essentially a fundraising organization. I think originally the idea was, or at points the idea is, well, like maybe we'll sort of re-import the kind of revolution, the people who can do the revolution back in Ireland, but that never quite gets going. But what you get is the Fenians, who in 1865 and then in 1867 try and stage rebellions against the British government. These, as in other times, fail pretty catastrophically. Much of the leadership is executed, and a lot of them are transported to Australia. So the IRB are founded in Dublin in 1858. I included this cartoon. There's a couple of them here. This is the Physic for Fenians, and this woman, this sort of beautiful woman, represents Ireland, and then this kind of portly fellow represents. He's called Dr. Bull. I was John Bull, the English, And what you see is this kind of peasanty-looking guy, and some of you may have seen this before. When Irish people are represented, especially the kind of lower bog-trotting kind of Irish, he looks kind of like a monkey. You can kind of see the extended part, and it was consciously done. It wasn't a sort of, this isn't a sort of accident. Aaron is saying, "I'm afraid, Dr. Dear, his symptoms are getting dangerous," and Dr. Bull, I see, I treated a somewhat similar case to this very successfully in India, leave him to me. And the sort of idea here is that there had been revolts in British India and that had been put down with extreme violence, and that this is what was called for. Here, this is from Punch, which is the sort of predominant humor, cultural magazine, cultural periodical from December of 1866 between the two abortive Fenian risings. At the same time, you have this sort of another idea, which is the sort of parliamentary way. The Irish, after 1798, with the Act of Union, the Irish get representatives in the British Parliament. Now, there's about 80 of them, I think, in a parliament of about 500 plus. So the idea is not, or the idea that occurs to some people is, if we can just get the Irish to vote as a bloc, then we'll be the sort of decisive force. And the sort of first main figure is Daniel O'Connell, often referred to as the liberator. They could never quite get everybody together to vote as a bloc, and the Irish parliamentary efforts, they're more and less successful. In the era of Gladstone, they tend to be a bit more successful. Gladstone is really pretty sympathetic to Irish, to the idea of at least some sort of dominion status for Ireland as opposed to Ireland as a sort of part of the Union. Charles Stewart Parnell is sort of next major figure. Parnell, unfortunately, there's a very famous Yeats poem that goes, Parnell came down the road, he said to the cheering man, "Ireland will have her freedom and you still break stone." Which is sort of, the point is, this is Yeats kind of latterly saying, Irish freedom is great, but to the common working man doesn't really make that much difference. Your life is going to be about the same, irrespective of who's running the show. Parnell was having an affair, which lots of people knew about and which blew up in his face. And then he died of some sort of softening of the brain fairly young. I mean, so he's 45, I think, when it happens. And then you get John Redmond. And once again, the idea is, Ireland wants to sort of vote as a bloc. It's going to be, this is going to be the way that it can sort of express its political power and get some sort of political power and justice through the British government that doesn't involve things blowing up and everyone getting hanged. So Redmond really, I mean, the IRB by the beginning of the 20th century is at a kind of low ebb. And Redmondism is really the only game in town, in a lot of respects. Redmond is a very popular figure. And if you're just in the sort of average Irish, whatever, or if you're in the sort of urban middle classes, really, this has a real attractiveness to you, right? Because it doesn't involve going out and killing people, going out and destroying things. What you want is, I mean, you might be sort of oriented to things getting better in Ireland, but what you also want is the way, if say you're a business owner, what you don't want is like catastrophic violence going on, right? What you want is predictable, stable, and you might also want Irish freedom. And Redmond is the kind of best path for this. At the same time, there's a kind of growth of Irish cultural organizations, the Gaelic Athletic Association, which exists to kind of regenerate Irish sports, particularly hurling. Any of you who've ever seen hurling, it's an incredible game. My wife and I were in London, or in Dublin on our honeymoon, and we happened to watch the hurling finals, which was on TV, and one of them took it's kind of like a mix between sort of like field hockey and I don't know what, almost baseball, but you can run around. Anyway, so you get this thing called a hurley, which is sort of like the sort of Irish version of a baseball bat, which is why. And one of the players, so that one of the teams took one right upside the head and it just opened him up. And the game just goes on. And my wife at a certain point looks at me, this is about 2 minutes to halftime, my wife says, well, why doesn't somebody help that man? He's got blood like running down. And I'm like, well, it's close to halftime. I think they don't want to, I think they're hoping he can tough it out, right? Hurling, by the way, also, I'll just tell you, I'm famous, I think, at the library for these useless facts. Hurling, they know it was played as early as the 7th century. And the reason is that the way they know this is because when the Ulster cycle got written down, the Ulster cycle, the great mythic cycle of Cuchulainn and all the sort of great Irish heroes, when it got written down by monks in the 7th century, they mention, so when Cuchulainn is young, he comes upon the Fina training on the Emin Macha, and they're playing hurling, and he bests like 100 of them, or depends on how you translate it. But so they know that at least at that point, hurling was being played because the monks who wrote the story down included that detail. So the GAA exists to kind of like they also have Gaelic football, which is sort of a mix of kind of like, it looks like a sort of mix between soccer and Australian rules football. It's very entertaining to watch, I will say. The Ancient Order of Hibernians, who are sort of more cultural conservative group. But so there are all these kind of groups sort of functioning within Irish society, but Redmondism is the sort of main political group. And you get this sort of period where, especially around the beginning of the war, where there's a sort of intensification of the connection between Ireland and Great Britain. Redmond is very pro-British in his sentiments vis-a-vis the war, and he really goes out of the way to try and emphasize that in public, to try and recruit, to try and get Irish people to join the British Army. And the British, at the same time in Ulster, you have Edward Carson and the Ulster Volunteers, the sort of intensely Protestant Presbyterian group, who are sort of starting to kind of march and drill. And you get in the southern part of Ireland the Irish Volunteers, who similarly engage in kind of paramilitary organization. Nobody is very heavily armed at this point, until the Ulster Volunteers start like almost openly buying guns, like bringing in large amounts of guns. And the sort of the Irish sort of revolutionary groups in Southern Ireland, which are very small at this point, look at this. At a certain point, I think it's Patrick Pearse who writes an article in which he basically says, look, the Ulster people are really showing the way for us. In a way, their buying guns is the sort of death knell for British rule in Ireland, because if you're going to put it on that basis, right, there's a lot more of us. We can buy guns, right, just as easily as they can. This turned out not to be true, although they did import some guns into the area around Dublin. It's not, it's not it's not that all that easy to get guns into a place without sort of especially like thousands of them without people knowing about it. But what the British government does is they kind of sandbag Redmond. Redmond wants to say, like, look, let's have like Irish-themed regiments. Let's have some sort of recognition that Irish people are getting out and supporting the British Empire. And the War Office is just completely uninterested in this, right? They don't do much for him. And as a result, by the middle of the war, Redmond really becomes a spent force. Like he really, support for Redmond really falls off. And also what you start to see is when the kind of like, so a lot of Irish people do join up, but then the sort of big casualty numbers start happening, and there's an intense fear in Ireland, especially in late 1915, early 1916, that the British are going to institute conscription. And this really works to the sort of benefit of the Irish revolutionary groups. One of the main leaders among this sort of community is Thomas Clark. Clark is born in Hampshire in England in 1858. He joins the IRB at the age of 19. He's arrested in London in 1883. The IRB staged a kind of dynamite campaign. They did this periodically. And he's sentenced to 15 years in Pentonville prison, which was a very nasty experience. It was very brutal conditions. They mostly could not speak. They had to sort of communicate through the walls with each other. But this just doesn't break him. It just makes his hatred for the British all that much more implacable. So that in 1898 he's released. He moves to the United States, gets hooked up with the Clan na Gael. But all the while he's sort of fomenting these ideas like about trying to get Irish liberation. And so in 1907 he moves back to Ireland, sets up a tobacconist shop in Dublin, and starts making contact. He's gotten hooked up with John Devoy. John Devoy was the sort of major figure in the Clan na Gael, the American-Irish organization. Devoy was an ex-soldier. He's a very intense guy, and one of these people who did not suffer fools at all. And so, you know, when people would come to him with certain ideas, he was very dismissive of Bampot schemes. What he thought was, we need to sort of raise funds, we need to buy guns, we need to have a physical force rebellion. He wasn't one of these people who were like, well, we can probably talk to the British and get them to whatever. Now, what's happened too, around the beginning of the war is that the British Parliament has voted to concede home rule. Now, they haven't exactly said how they're going to do this. And it's one of those things where the devil is very much in the details, because there's a large proportion there's a significant number, let's say, not a large proportion, of people in Ulster, in the northern part, who absolutely do not want home rule. I mean, Edward Carson is a figure very similar to, in a lot of respects, to George Wallace. I mean, union today, union tomorrow, union forever. But they sort of say, well, look, we got this war going on, and there's, you know, we nearly had a mutiny in Ulster. The army had sort of said, well, if you take certain steps, we won't come out and defend if you try and take steps against the UVF, the Ulster Volunteers. Now, they hadn't really said very seriously. I mean, it was one of those things that was kind of more of a threat than actually happened. This is referred to as the Curragh Mutiny, but there's no real mutiny that happens. But it did sort of to put the fear into the British government. So they sort of say, well, look, when the war ends, right, then we'll talk about this, right? And it's a real sort of kicking the can down the road. It's, you know, it's like, let's keep these people on side for now, and then who knows what will have happened by the end of the war. But this plays well with a lot of people. So, I mean, it's once again, you get the sort of like, you have a large number of kind of Irish volunteers. The Irish volunteers are the sort of main leaders, a guy named Owen MacNeill, who's a sort of scholarly student of Irish culture. But what starts to happen through the early years of the First World War is that the IRB progressively becomes infiltrated, or the Irish Volunteers, excuse me, progressively becomes infiltrated by the IRB, so that IRB men start to work their way into leadership positions in the Irish Volunteers. And MacNeill doesn't sort of notice that this is happening for a while. It's not until sort of 1915 that he realizes, people tell him, look, like, if you look at who's the leadership council of the Irish Volunteers now, a large proportion of them are IRB men. And this is an important thing because the IRB is explicitly a physical force organization. The Irish Volunteers are not, I mean, some people more than others, but the Irish Volunteers are more about sort of Irish identity. I mean, they do a certain amount of paramilitary drilling, right, but they're not really a physical force organization per se in the way that the IRB is. One of the leading figures in the IRB at this point is Patrick Pearse. Pearse is born in Dublin in 1879. He joins the Gaelic League in 1896. He only learns Irish sort of in adolescence, but he really takes on Irish culture at that point. He founds a school, St. Enda's, with the poet Thomas MacDonagh, where the teaching is bilingual. By this point, most people in Ireland speak English. The British had made it illegal for a long time to teach the Irish language. Actually, there's a famous sort of Irish folk song that the Clancy brothers used to do called Moses O'Toole, which is about a Jewish fellow is like opening a business in Dublin, and he puts up a sign, and he's, in Hebrew. And a cop comes along and arrests him because he's so stupid that he thinks that the sign must be, he can't read it, so he assumes it must be in Irish, and he arrests the guy. Turns out the judge is a Jew too, and so there's some sort of iffy qualities about this song, but it's kind of, the point is that the English are so stupid that they can't figure out what's Irish and what isn't. Pearse is a really fiery guy and very committed to Irish liberation, also very committed to the idea of the blood sacrifice. He publishes a poem which is called Mother, and which goes, "I do not grudge them, Lord, I do not grudge my 2 strong sons that I have seen go out to break their strength and die. They and a few in bloody protest for a glorious thing. They shall be spoken of among their people, the generations shall remember them and call them blessed. But I will speak their names to my own heart. In the long nights, the little names that were familiar once, round my dead hearth, Lord, thou art hard on mothers. We suffer in their coming and their going, and though I grudge them not, I weary of the long sorrow, and yet I have my joy. My sons were faithful and they fought." So the idea is like this mother like being prepared to sacrifice her children, and it's very clear that the things she's prepared to sacrifice them to is the cause of Irish freedom. Where's my page here? In 1915, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rosa, who's another one of these famous old Fenians, dies. He's brought back to Ireland, and they stage a gigantic funeral for him. There's sort of like military cortege and all sorts of things. He's buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. And the IRB gets Pearse chosen to give the funeral oration. And I wish I could quote all of it. It's a really compelling speech, but Pearse, this is the sort of finishing part, and it's a thing that rings through the history of Ireland. "Our foes are strong and wise and wary, but strong and wise and wary as they are, they cannot undo the miracles of God who ripens in the hearts of young men, the seed sown by the young men of a former generation. And the seeds sown by the young men of 65 and 67 are coming to their miraculous ripening today. Rulers and defenders of the realm had need be wary if they would guard against such processes. Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations. The defenders of this realm have worked well in secret and in the open. They think they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything, that they have provided against everything. But the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead. And while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." This is an electric speech. It's amazing that he wasn't arrested for this. As a matter, Piers Beasley, who's another sort of literary figure, was arrested for giving a speech in content not all that different from this. And the British were certainly watching. But this lays out an agenda, right? We're relating to these earlier attempts at achieving Irish liberation. And there's no way that the British could stop us, right? Because we have the kind of holy graves of the people who went before and who gave their lives. And so now, it's created this tradition. And there was a feeling among the IRB people that something had to be done relatively soon, that the war provided a kind of space for this to happen, that every generation should have its own kind of rebellion. They're negotiating with the Germans. A couple of IRB figures are attempting to get the Germans to actually invade the western part of Ireland. They keep the Germans are hinky about this because, for I think fairly obvious reasons. But what they do get is the Germans to commit a fair number of weapons. I say a fair number, some rifles, and mostly kind of out of date. But rifles are not pikes and they're not Hurleys. I mean, a rifle will get a lot of business done that a handheld weapon will not. The sort of main figure of this is Roger Casement. Casement was a kind of Anglo-Irish aristocrat. He had come to prominence earlier on as a sort of critic of Belgian rule in the Congo, and had written a very compelling critique of the incredible brutality of Belgian rule in the Congo. Casement once again, he's another one of these kind of like another sort of Wolfe Tone in a lot of respects. He's one of these sort of Anglo-Irish aristocratic figures who is committed to this idea of Irish freedom, even though he's not from the kind of like old Catholic, rural tradition. This is O'Donovan Rosa's funeral, and you can see here Patrick Pearse in military uniform. Another key figure is James Connolly. Connolly is born in Edinburgh. He's an ex-soldier. He deserted he saw some combat, but then he deserted in 1889 because his regiment was going to get sent to India and he didn't want to go there. He becomes involved in the socialist movement. There's a lot of argument about what was really up with James Connolly. He clearly read Marx, and he clearly was very influenced by Marx. Toward the end of his life, he says a lot more kind of like romantic nationalist things, so there's a sort of long, ongoing, and unresolvable debate about whether he was a Marxist or a Irish romantic, whatever, or some combination of the two. He moves to Ireland in the first decade of the 20th century, and becomes sort of deputy to Jim Larkin. Jim Larkin is the sort of predominant labor leader in Dublin. He leads the Irish unions during a period of intense struggle. There's a big lockout in Dublin, employers' lockout, which eventually the employers win. But the point here being that so for a long time there was a sort of idea that Easter 1916 was a sort of romantic nationalist project, and that was it. What this really shows, what Connolly's involvement really shows, and what a lot of later research has shown, is there was a lot of labor militancy going on in Ireland too. I mean, the political agitation had mostly been in the rural areas up to that point. There was the Land League in the late 19th century, the idea of which was, let's get land in the hands of Irish people and not of the sort of British absentee landlords or what have you. But so there starts to be, as the kind of urban population grows, more real labor militancy, and Connolly is very much at the forefront of that. He starts in 1913 the Irish Citizen Army, which is a kind of another armed group, much smaller than the IRB, but they kind of interface with the IRB. And he gets brought into the kind of collective organization with Tom Clark and with Patrick Pearse. And as a matter of fact, like one of the reasons that Easter 1916 kicks off is because the IRB are a little worried that the ICA is going to go out on its own. And so they think, well, we've got to do, if the ICA, they have to kind of convince Connolly, we're all going to do this together. I felt obligated to include this. Constance Markovic, She was born Constance Booth, and the reason is sort of like each of these guys kind of represents a different sort of, so Patrick Pearse and Thomas MacDonagh are the kind of like Gaelic, Catholic tradition. Connolly is a more sort of labor tradition. Clark is the kind of Fenian, like long-term, intense revolutionary. And Constance Markovic is from this very well-heeled Anglo-Irish family. She was good friends with Yeats. As a matter of fact, some of you may remember the Yeats poem that starts, "The light of evening, Lissadell, great windows look out on the north," which is, so he knew, Yeats was friends with Constance Booth and her sister Ava. But she was a very intense, she was one of these, like, another one of these sort of Anglo-Irish people who was very intensely about Irish nationalism. But she also was very politically to the left and associated with Connolly. Works with the ICA during the lockout of 1913 when Connolly is Jim Larkin's deputy. You can see her like in full uniform here with carrying a gun. She married a Ukrainian aristocrat, kept his name after he left. But she's a very intense person. We'll get to this a little bit later. But in the course of the rising itself, she actually shoots a policeman. I mean, she's really like, she's not a messing around kind of person. And she's very lucky. She didn't get executed, almost certainly, mostly because she was female. So this is Owen McNeill. He had founded the Irish Volunteers in 1913 as a sort of response to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers. Once again, his organization gets heavily infiltrated by the IRB. At a certain point in 1915, when he realizes this is the case, he goes to the leadership of the Irish Volunteers and says, look, I'm going to add a bunch of other people to this leadership group. And the IRB immediately realizes what's going on. But the IRB feels like if we don't do this, then McNeill is going to split the group and it's all going to fall apart. By the spring of 1916, when it becomes clear that something is going to happen, McNeill kind of knows that something is going on. But even in the like 2 days, I believe it is, before the rising happens, he goes to Patrick Pearse and asks him, "Are you guys going to go out? I mean, I've heard that there might be something happening on Eastern. Are you guys going out?" And Pearse lies to his face. Pearse says, "No, absolutely not." But then he figures out that it is happening. So the mobilization order goes out to Irish volunteers. The idea is we're going to go out on Easter Sunday. McNeill, horrified by this prospect, because he really was not a physical force man, issues a public countermanding of this order and sends people around to all the Irish volunteer groups to say, look, under no circumstances are you to drill whatever on Easter. So there's a moment where the leaders have this meeting, the IRB leaders, Pearse and McDonough, Sean McDermott, Eamon Kent, Connolly, have a meeting on Sunday night. And they say, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to go out or whatever? And they finally, after a lot of arguing, decide, well, we have to do something. So they decide that they're going to stage the rebellion on Easter Monday. They think, well, a lot of people will still be out of town. The British aren't expecting it, which they weren't. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether this was meant, whether they thought they were going to succeed. James Connolly famously going out the door says, well, we're going out to be slaughtered. But I really think that if you look at it pretty clearly, they thought that there was at least some chance that they could succeed. That if they held out for a while, maybe the Germans would come, or maybe the country would rise to support them. I mean, this is a very small group of people that they think is going to go out. And by the time it actually happens, only about 1,500 people in total go out. But I think it's, I was talking, I was helped to prepare this by a fellow named Michael Murphy, who's a lecturer from Cambridge, his son lives in Painesville, and he comes around periodically. We got talking, and it turned out he was doing this thing, or it turned out I was doing this thing, and we had a lot of conversations about it. And one of the things he said, the way he described it to me is like, think about, the Browns going out to play the Eagles. There's about a 99% chance that they're not going to win, right? But you can't go out there, I had a coach in high school who was fond of saying, people who don't think they can win don't win, right? So they thought to themselves, well, a few things have to go our way, but there's a possibility that this can work. So I think we're wrong if we view it as a sort of pure blood sacrifice. This is an attempt to achieve Irish freedom. That's a desperate attempt, right? But one that it wasn't just meant to be suicide either. It was meant to be, we're going to do this thing. If a few things go right, this might work. So on the 16th of April, the Easter Monday, passers-by on the main drag of Dublin were bemused to see a bunch of people in military uniform heading out to the front of the GPO, the General Post Office, which is in what's now called O'Connell Street, in the sort of main drag just north of the Liffey, the River Liffey that roughly bisects Dublin. And the following proclamation is read out, and I'm only going to read the first paragraph, and I'll explain why in a second. Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland through us summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. Irish men and Irish women. Now this is absolutely key. The Irish Republican Brotherhood has a sort of women's wing called Cumann na mBan. The IRA actually picked it up later on. Cumann na mBan is, in the IRA is actually a very interesting organization. It's very shadowy and little known. Cumann na mBan members absolutely never give interviews, so it's still like mostly unknown about what goes on internally or what went on internally. But Pierce is an old school Catholic guy who believes that sort of men are one thing and women have another role. So it's very important that they actually include Irish women, and actually between 100 and 300 Cumann na mBan members go out and participate. There's a picture which I found and which I then unfortunately lost of Irish women rebels somewhere in the south, I think in Wexford somewhere, going out like fully armed, and it's an intense thing too. I wish I could find the picture too because they're smiling. I think that this is intense. There's another really great picture which you'll sometimes see of like guys in the GPO. And there's one guy who's from the ICA who's got this sort of goofy grin on his face. Man, there's an excellent possibility you're going to get killed in the next 48 hours here. But there was a kind of this feeling like, we're going, and it's a very sort of, it's hard not to be, even if you don't think that the physical force thing is a great idea, it's hard not to be attracted to these people in a way because they're so, not joyful, but they have a kind of, a certain something. It's a little hard to put into words. So this is the GPO. It's on the right side of the road looking south. The River Liffey is just down there. This is the GPO afterwards. So essentially what happens, I put the map in the wrong order, so I'm going to there it is. You can't see terribly well, so I'm just going to point out to you. So the GPO is here. The units, and there's only about 1,500 people who end up going out, about 100 members of the ICA and about 1,400 others who end up going out. Get sort of spread out around the city. And what they're trying to do is stop the sort of ingress of British soldiers. Eamon de Valera gets sent to Jacob's factory, Jacob's biscuit factory down here, where he does almost nothing except go a little nuts for about 4 days. There's fighting sort of around here. They do not occupy Trinity College, which leaves a gigantic hole in their sort of perimeter. There's occupation of the Mendicity Institute over here. They do not occupy Dublin Castle, which turns out to be a catastrophic mistake because there's only about 6 people in Dublin Castle at the time. A unit of the IRA, or of the IRB, of the Irish Volunteers, excuse me, heads up that way. There's a sort of brief exchange of fire between them and like the 6 people actually in the castle. Everybody's on vacation. And then sort of inexplicably they don't take the castle, which would have been a really great idea because that was the kind of nerve center of British rule of Ireland. They do take the forecourts. There's O'Connell Street, there's the GPO right there. They set up pretty heavily at Bowmans Mill, and there's where the first sort of major exchange comes. So the British, the first people who actually get killed by this thing, they go into the GPO and they have to like shoot guns into the ceiling to get people like, okay, something's happening here, everybody get out. And they start fortifying it. And then what happens is there's a kind of like unit of kind of like older guys who do sort of military training with the British Army, and they happen to be on maneuvers. And they come marching into town. I think they're unarmed, and they run into a whole bunch of these IRB guys, and the IRB guys just open up on them. And so the first guys to get killed are a bunch of these sort of like older guys who are just sort of like happen to be in uniform. It's a sort of unfortunate thing. But the whole event is pretty unfortunate. There's a lot of sort of, in total about 600 people get killed. And roughly more civilians than combatants get killed. About 66 IRB, Irish Volunteers, get killed. Slightly more British get killed. Particularly around here, they come marching up from the southeast, and they meet pretty stiff resistance at Bowmans Mill, but also like in these houses right here, where there's about 2 or 3 volunteer snipers who keep a very large number of British troops pinned down for the better part of a day. So the British pretty quickly realized, I mean, so like one sort of like pattern of thought among the IRB and among the Irish volunteer types is, well, this is the capital of a sort of major British province, right? They're not going to destroy it, like, so, you know, maybe we can fight it out with them with small arms. This turns out not to be right. The British are very willing to actually inflict large amounts of damage on Dublin, and within a couple of days, once they've shifted troops over from England into Ireland, they bring to bear a fair amount of artillery and a gunboat cruising up and down the Liffey, especially near the forecourts. That is Bowmans Mill. Let's see if I can, there we go. So this is O'Connell Street. There's the statue right there. The GPO is sort of on the other side of the street. And what you can see is there's extensive destruction in the central part of Dublin. And so once again, there's a sort of common view that everybody was like, all the locals were totally against the rising, which is sort of true and sort of not. People in the poorer areas tended to be sympathetic. People in the better-to-do areas tended not to be. And generally, people got less sympathetic to it when the British were like pounding large parts of the central part of the city. Because it became a really dangerous situation, and this is why, like, the majority of the people who get killed are in fact civilians. Also, there's the British end up executing a number of people just sort of randomly. They're very annoyed about this, and you can understand why. Because here they have, this is in the middle of a war, right? I mean, in the middle of the First World War, an incredibly brutal historical event. One, it's worth reading the Pat Barker Regeneration, The Ghost Road, and The Eye in the Door. Pat Barker wrote a series of historical novels about England during the First World War, and you can really see like the war had this intense and very harsh effect on British society, as you might expect, with tens of thousands of people being killed and wounded. Now, there's not a huge amount to tell about the sort of minutia of the rising itself, except to say that by and large, the Irish managed to hold out for about 4 or 5 days, the Irish volunteers. And it mostly has to do with the reason they surrender. Sometimes they're sort of pushed back by, the GPO was basically reduced to a sort of shell. But a lot of it, too, has to do with the lack of food and water, running low on ammunition. They don't really have a lot of guns because Casement's attempt to land guns on the West Coast has failed catastrophically. The German submarine that was sort of supposed to, that landed him, didn't meet up with the boat, and it didn't work out. They were trying to bring them on in a yacht called the Asgard, but they ended up getting caught. Casement is later Casement is hanged. There's a sort of interesting thing here with that, but at a certain point on the 21st, the Pierce orders everyone to surrender, and it's pretty clear. The idea is that probably the leadership are going to be executed, but they surrender because they don't want everyone else to be killed. So the leadership are imprisoned in Kilmainham jail. And then the British start actually executing people. And this causes a real sea change in people's thinking about this. Because now they're thinking, people who might have been against it think, well, what harm are these? Could just put them in jail, right? So on the 3rd of May, Patrick Pearse, Thomas MacDonagh, and Thomas Clark are executed in the Stonebreakers Yard at Kilmainham Jail. I think I have a picture of it. Let me just see here. Yes. So this is the yard where the executions were done. They're shot. Casement is hanged, and the sort of Casement thing is like, well, he's sort of more of a traitor's thing, whereas like these are sort of military executions in a certain sense. On the next day, Joseph Plunkett, another one of the signatories of the announcement of the Republic, William Pierce, Patrick Pierce's brother. Really, that was just reprisal. Willie Pierce had almost nothing to do with the rebellion. They just executed him because he was Patrick Pierce's brother. Edward Daly, Michael O'Hanrahan. The 5th of May, John McBride. John McBride was a kind of adventurer. He had fought in the Boer War. He wasn't really up for it, and he ran into a bunch of volunteers walking around in Dublin on the first day. And it's like, oh yeah, I'll go along. He's a sort of, he's one of those kind of like slightly louche figures. He was married for a while to Maud Gonne, who was a very prominent Irish literary figure, very friendly with William Butler Yeats. And they had gotten divorced, and she, in divorce court, accused him of having abused her and sexually molested her child, which there's no evidence sort of either way, but it comes up later, so it's worth remembering. The 8th of May, Eamon Kent, Michael Mallon, Sean Houston, Con Colbert. And then the 12th of May, James Connolly. Connolly is so badly wounded at this point, he has to be tied to a chair in front of the firing squad. He was actually dying of gangrene from a wound anyway, but they executed him anyway. And Sean McDermott. They're going to execute Eamon de Valera, but it turns out that because he has American citizenship as well, they decide that probably for the best that they not do this. The rest, a fairly large number, and let's see if I've written it down, I meant to. Get sent off to Stafford Jail in England and then to a prison camp called Ffrangeg in Wales. There they're held until quite late in the war. Eventually they're sort of released. But the executions really, once again, they cause a kind of sea change. And there's a sort of moment when the Irish parliamentary deputies get up in the British Parliament and say, look, this is the one Irish rebellion in which you actually had the people on your side, right? And you're just absolutely washing it away in a sea of blood. Like, if you could just have resisted this is one of those sort of classic kind of British things. You're familiar with Irish history, like if you remember, those of you who know about Bloody Sunday, when the paratroopers killed 13 people at a civil rights march, it was a catastrophic own goal. Like, the civil rights movement was great for British rule in Ireland. I mean, it wasn't, if they could have just gotten everybody together on that basis. But no, and the IRA in 1972, when this happens, is moribund. And the IRA at that point had split into the provisionals and the officials, and they could barely sort of muster up the organizational wherewithal to clip each other's activists occasionally. And after that, the IRA, people are just lining up to join the IRA. And the same way with this. People are very, annoyed with the kind of Irish revolutionary types after this happens. And then the executions start, and they're like, hey, wait, what's the point of this? Right? And so there's a real change in people's attitude. And this is one reason why this is important. Because what happens in sort of subsequent days is that people who were veterans of the rising get out and start to recreate the Republican movement, the movement for an Irish republic or an Irish free state. And two in particular are important here. One is Eamon de Valera. De Valera, you can see him in British custody. He eventually becomes president of Ireland in the 1950s. He becomes actively involved in the Irish Republican Army as it sort of exists after 1918. After the Free State Treaty is signed, he goes into sort of opposition. During the Irish Civil War, there was a kind of civil war after the Free State Treaty was signed because some people thought that because they hadn't included Ulster in the deal that it was a kind of sellout. The other key figure here is Michael Collins. Michael Collins is a sort of West Cork farm boy he's the youngest of 7 children. I think his father was about 70 when he's born. He ends up, so he's kind of the baby of the family. He ends up going to London, working in a bank for a while. And he then returning to Ireland and becoming involved in revolutionary politics. He first comes to sort of like British, the attention of the British when he's in Stafford Jail, where he becomes really irritating to them because he's one of these sort of like jailhouse lawyers. He's constantly arguing with the jailers about how things should be done or whatever. And then he gets sent to Ffrangeg, same deal. He's like organizing people. And then he becomes the sort of treasurer of the Irish Republican Army. But what he actually becomes is the kind of minister of war. Collins builds himself into one of the most feared and efficient guerrilla leaders in the history of modern urban conflict. He manages to penetrate with his spies the British administration in Ireland. He, at a certain point in 1921, has all 7 members of a British security team assassinated on the same morning. He's an intensely hard guy. Like there's a detail in Tim Pat Coogan's biography of Collins in which he and his friends growing up in West Cork, which is a sort of like hard-bitten kind of small farm type area, used to play a game called Getting a Bit of Ear, where like you would jump on one of your friends unawares and try and like bite part of their ear off. I mean, if this is the kind of game you're playing for sort of, you must be kind of an intense, it's the kind of thing that sort of more genteel society doesn't go for. But he's a very hard guy, and if Collins thought that you needed to be clipped, it was going to happen. He started his sort of favorite hit team were these 12 young men from the Dublin unit he called them the Apostles. They were young men who who were unmarried and had no families. And he would just send them around. A lot of times he would give people warnings, right? You have the option to leave Ireland now, or you're going to be killed. But if you didn't, there was a very good chance that he was pretty merciless about people he thought needed to be eliminated. And so there's a British officer named Lee Wilson who, after the Irish had surrendered, took out Thomas Clark, stripped him naked, and made him stand naked on the lawn in front of the yard of the forecourts for hours on end. And 4 years later, an IRA hit team caught up with him in the town of Gorey and shot him. And Collins someone else remembered, like he ran into Collins in a bar later that night and was like, yep, we got that guy. So Collins remembered, and he had a very sort of pronounced solution to problems, and that solution was getting rid of the problem. The thing that I really sort of want to finish with is William Butler Yeats, who's arguably the greatest of Irish literary figures. What?
Not arguable.
Well, yeah, yes.
James Joyce fans are wrong.
Right, yeah, I was afraid I'd done something wrong, but that's okay. Writes this poem, and as a sort of elegy for the sort of Irish rebels. And a lot of times these elegies they have a kind of short shelf life. But Collins writes this thing, and I really think in a way it's the kind of most affecting thing about the whole event. He starts out, I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among gray 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion round the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. All changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. So what he's sort of saying is, Dublin's sort of literary society, Dublin was a small town, and he knew all these people. He knew Pearse, he knew McDonough. He'd met them all. He didn't think they were really he thought they were kind of like loopy and romantic, which is a funny thing coming from a guy who was like a devotee of Aleister Crowley. But it was like, he found the rising very affecting. It's a terrible beauty. He won't sort of let you sit down on either side. It's beautiful because these people did this thing, but it's also terrible because it's so violent. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? This is Constance Markovic, who was his friend. Constance wore Booth, rode to harriers. She had fox hunted. She was from a sort of upper crust type family. This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. These are Patrick Pearse and Thomas McDonough. This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who were near to my heart. Yet I number him in this song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. So this is a kind of funny thing because he's talking about John McBride, who was a fairly minor player in the whole thing. But because John McBride had this sort of thing with Maud Gonne, who Yeats was really in love with, he sort of like devotes half or a third of a stanza. Then there's this third stanza that nobody remembers. I can recite this entire poem from memory except this one. And it's basically hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. And basically he's saying, like, you know, people who get this one sort of fixed idea, you know, he has these images about like the world sort of going on around, and these people are like a stone in a stream, unmoving and unsort of changed. And this is his kind of way of talking about the Irish revolutionaries. They're just fixated on this romantic idea about Ireland, which he was not sympathetic to. I mean, he didn't really care that much about home rule. He was a sort of cultural nationalist. I mean, it's funny too because it's very pronouncedly Anglo-Irish Protestant. And then we come to this third line, or this fourth stanza, and I think that this is in a way sort of one of the most compelling things ever written about a group of people, but particularly about this topic. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part, to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. And what is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that's done and said. They may give home rule, the way it said. Why did, you know, it may be that there was really no point to this. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonough and McBride, and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is warm, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. And this, I think, in a way, is the sort of most compelling thing about this. So the thing that you notice, the difference between Ireland in the period leading up to 1916 and the period afterward, is this tremendous increase in the sort of level of ambient violence. Especially starting in 1918 with the sort of once becomes clear that the British are not going to concede home rule, the IRA ramps up the level of violence. I recommend to you the book A Star Called Henry by Roddy Doyle. The main character is a kind of young man. He fights in the GPO. When the sort of War of Liberation happens in 1918, 19, 20, 21, he's out in the West Country and he meets these group of guys who are like, you know, maybe we can attack a barracks or something and get some guns. He comes back a couple of years later and they've sort of morphed into a sort of mafia group. And there was a sort of real, like a sort of pretty blurry dividing line that grew up, like especially in the West Country. And they basically tell him, whatever's going on in Dublin is fine here, but you don't come back here because we'll kill you if you do. So just lots of people in the period in 19, 20, 21 in Ireland are getting killed for a lot of reasons. And what you get is this sort of, I think Yeats's description of it as of terrible beauty is very much on the mark. That it's very much a matter of, there are these very noble sentiments that people have, but in order to accomplish them, the means that have to be undertaken maybe are not unacceptable, but leave everything kind of changed and leave a situation in which the two things, the terribleness and the beauty, have to coexist with each other. So that's what I have. Thank you very much for coming. I will take questions.